Human society doesn't just happen. Thanks to pop culture, we tend to have an idea that we moved straight from grunting in caves and playing with fire into advanced kingdoms like ancient Egypt and Assyria. But this simply isn't true. In fact, there was an entire period of transition known as the Neolithic. It began with people hunting mammoths, rowing across narrow bodies of water, and living in caves on the edges of receding glaciers, and it ended with whole societies being built. And one great place to see this transition clearly is on the island of Cyprus. And that is what I want to talk about today.
Hi everyone, this is Travels with an Archaeologist. I'm the Archaeologist, now let's get into the travels.
Yup, today I'm going back into the Neolithic on the island of Cyprus to a site called Choirokoitia. Hold on, man, let me try this out. Khirokitia. Yes, sorry. I'm afraid my Greek is terrible, but the site is not. So, let's get right into it. Neolithic means New Stone Age. Given that the Stone Age is a euphemism for ancient, calling it new might seem like a bit of an oxymoron, but in fact all it means is that this is the most recent period of time where people were still only using stone tools and had not yet mastered metalworking. The Neolithic tends to be marked by the end of the last ice age some 10 to 12,000 years ago, and it ends as soon as people start working with new materials for tools, such as copper and bronze. While this transition varies in how and when it takes place depending on the region and the resources available to it, it was overall a global trend. And as for Cyprus, the most notable thing about the Neolithic was that it was now inhabited. Cyprus was initially settled by people from the Levant sometime at the very beginning of the Neolithic around 11,000 BCE, and these first arrivals were hunter-gatherers living in caves and rock shelters like this one. This looks pretty cozy, doesn't it? It's right here in Khirokitia. And Khirokitia is important because it is the largest site from this period on Cyprus and is typical of some of the earliest villages our ancestors were building. They were able to utilize local materials, and it actually made for a pretty decent house. So this is a recreation of the Neolithic village of Khirokitia. And of course, in reality, only these stone bases survive on the archaeology site. What comes up here is a recreation built of a mix of adobe and mud brick. And you can see up here they have a flat roof. These houses were indeed small and simple, and they were intended to last for generations. They also predate pottery. Khirokitia dates to a period of Cypriot archaeology known as the Aceramic Neolithic. And this is a bit of a problem given that archaeologists kind of depend on pottery to date sites. Pottery wasn't exactly unknown in this era, but it also wasn't common, and there wasn't a big trend of pottery on the mainland when they first arrived. But that didn't mean that they didn't have their own innovations. So the thing with Khirokitia, apart from having these sorts of houses, is that it also had wells. And what makes these wells important? Well, actually, they're some of the earliest in the world. In fact, some even argue that they're the earliest wells in the world, dating to about 9,000 BCE, almost to the first settlement period. So I actually used an earlier date than most people accept, to be honest. I confused BCE with years ago, and I do apologize for that. It was the end of the day, and that was the best take we could do, especially since, as you're going to see in the rest of this video, my camera was having issues adjusting to the harsh light of Cyprus. But the point still stands, and the theory of these being the first water wells in the world still holds water. And no, I am not apologizing for that one. And while these innovations may look simple today, think about what it took. They had to know where to dig for water and how deep they intended to go. And remember, these people were cavemen. Cavemen. Just think about that. People who were coming out here were essentially living in caves and one day decided to say, you know what, let's build some houses. And they did. This was the first urban settlement in Europe, and now that's problematic for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because I'm not sure how urban this counts as, and secondly, calling Cyprus part of Europe is actually really politically problematic, but I think that's a topic for a different video. The point is, society did not all just happen in one day. The people up here started out living in caves and they ended up living in houses, and this place was inhabited right down to the modern day. To this day, the village of Khirokitia is inhabited by a couple thousand modern Cypriots, I believe. I haven't had time to research that fact, don't fact check me on that one. And although this transition happened over generations, not overnight, it isn't really an exaggeration. People did not settle here by accident, nor were they isolated. These houses in the shape of a circle were quite purposeful. You don't need to know a lot about math to know that a circle provides the most efficient use of space in any given area. And these people were building in circles because they knew it too. They wanted to maximize space and minimize materials, which is why the circular houses stood the test of time.
And then there's this site, Lempa Lekoi, which is also a Neolithic settlement, but this is from much later time in the Neolithic. This is after the ceramics began being created. This is actually right on the cusp of becoming the Bronze Age. And you can see there's quite a bit of similarity between Lempa Lekoi and Khirokitia. And this is because the people here were still developing these very same societal techniques that the people in Khirokitia were doing.
This site, too, is built in very similar circles, despite the fact it actually was built at the tail end of Khirokitia's zenith, and already it was using more sophisticated technology. They look similar, but they are more sophisticated, with evidence of hearths within their homes, and it contained a huge number of seeds and bones, indicating there was a far more developed agricultural economy. And to the great relief of many archaeologists, ceramics are also in use here for all but the earliest of phases. Now you might be wondering why ceramics suddenly appeared on Cyprus, seemingly without explanation, but it might be a better question to ask what took them so long. Because nothing was isolated here. These hills were settled by people with a deep appreciation for the land and what it could provide, and they could wake up every morning and stare out at the hills.
I absolutely love the ruggedness of these hills, and so did the Cypriots. You can see why this island was such a sanctuary for Aphrodite. But whatever resources they have in them, they don't have obsidian. That's why obsidian caused quite a fuss when it was discovered at this site in Khirokitia in 9000 BCE.
This means that Cyprus was engaging in long-distance trade ever since the first humans settled here. And given that Cyprus acted as a main hub of trade in the Bronze Age, it's safe to assume that this was sustained. Now, I will do a video on how Cyprus was affected by the Bronze Age collapse. It's genuinely fascinating, but for now let's return to the Neolithic site of Khirokitia. Because as sophisticated as this looks, a closer examination reveals that this was indeed the earliest phase of civilization. In order to further maximize space, what we see are their dead being buried under these houses, with grave goods alongside them. So people were living over the graves of their ancestors. The Neolithic is known for its unusual and unique burial customs, as anyone who watched my West Bank video will have seen with the Jericho skulls, so compared to other practices at the time, burying your dead whole and under the floor of where you live is actually rather normal. Likewise, there is no evidence of animal husbandry taking place inside the walls. This is not in itself too unusual, but other evidence suggests that they supplemented their diet with hunting and gathering. They also engaged in early cultivation and processed food. But it was all still primitive. These were household-level processing areas not done on the sort of grand industrial scale that would define later eras. Agriculture and animal husbandry were still in infancy. However, stone tool-making was done on an industrial scale at this time, hence why we see evidence of the trade of raw materials for stone tools, but not for other processed goods. Yet, trade was possible, and this was because the city was organized. I mean, the site's very existence indicates some form of social stratification. This huge fortification wall not only indicates that there was already a need for defenses like this against rivals, probably Tenta Calabassos down the road, but it also speaks to organized collective labor, the sort seen in city-states and later chiefdoms. Controlling access to the village were these three staircases, all meeting at this giant exterior enclosure, a structure that is absolutely unique in its construction. But again, like burial practices, Neolithic architecture gets pretty weird. Tenta Calabassos, just down the road, also has unique Neolithic structures. This is because it is an age of innovation and experimentation, and just as we still produce dead ends and make improvements, the Stone Age villagers did too. They continued to build and repair the wall for thousands of years, expanded the village outward, and gradually built up their industries.
Okay, so it might not be fair to call the people of the Neolithic cavemen per se, but it's also not unfair either. What we see is a transition from living in cave to living in homes, and it's not all happening at once. We can see in the Neolithic society starting to build itself. In the beginning of the Neolithic, we do have people living in caves, learning how to make small huts, learning how to make small tools. learning animal husbandry and crop growing, and by the end of the Neolithic, the only difference between them and the Iron Age is essentially that the Iron Age knew how to write.
Khirokitia reached its apogee around 6500 BCE, which was roughly 3.5 millennia before the first written records appear. So how these people lived and died, what they believed, and their level of sophistication can only be gleaned from archaeology. They are the distant past, and yet they were very much capable scientists and logicians pushing the limits of their time.
So, as silly as it may seem to put the highway behind me in the same shot as the Neolithic settlement this way, this actually goes to what I've been saying throughout all of my videos. As conscious and logical and reasonable as you are, that is as conscious and logical and reasonable as the people who built this village were too. The same people who use this highway were no different from the people who built this, except for their level of technology and their level of education. They knew how to build houses. They knew how to grow their society. They knew how to innovate. They found shortcuts. They found ways to become a bigger people. Innovation and invention is not a trend. It's not a modern trend. It is a pattern, and one that we see throughout all of human history.
This particular phase of aceramic Khirokitia was abandoned in about 6000 BCE, and it was not re-inhabited until a couple of millennia later, when it was suddenly inundated with the new ceramic and later Chalcolithic cultures. This ancient mound was then rediscovered in 1934, and a decade of excavations followed. They resumed under the French in 1976, and the city was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1998. There is still a lot of this site to be uncovered, and so many secrets here remain buried. Meanwhile, the site of Lempa-Lekoi, despite less surviving, shows that some features were retained, and that it was not quite forgotten. This site is much younger. It arose just a couple hundred years before Khirokitia was abandoned, but it shows a more sophisticated transition, of people who were well established in terms of animal husbandry, agriculture, technology, and ceramics. And this site was abandoned about 2400 BCE, just as the Cypriots had begun their own metalworking and the Old Kingdom of Egypt was flourishing. The Neolithic is, in short, an amazing period of time to study, full of wonderful weirdness and yet a comforting familiarity, and Khirokitia is no exception, offering a fascinating and unique window into this period of transition. Although the people who built this city are long gone, with not even a whisper of them in written history, they nevertheless survive in us. They survive in the trail they blazed for our society to move forward, in the foundations of our global trade networks, and in every spark of curiosity that allows us to ask questions, experiment, and progress as a species. And yet we will never know their names. All we can do is look on their ruins in awe, and imagine what life must have been like for these people on the earliest dawn of civilization, building Europe's first city among the beautiful, rugged hills of Cyprus 9,000 years ago.
I need to acknowledge a mistake. In my Bronze Age collapse video, one commenter rightly pointed out that the Etruscans did not speak an Indo-European language, and I had said they did. Now, this line was in reference to the Sea People's origins possibly being Etruscan, but as much as this was not the topic of the video, it was nevertheless wrong, and it proves just how much I need to fact check even with these supposedly throwaway lines. So I will continue to strive to be as accurate as possible in my future videos, and in the meantime, thank you for keeping me honest on it. Right, so I really liked this site. This is a cool site, and you know what? I almost didn't come here. The only reason I came here is because one of my patrons said, hey, do more Neolithic stuff, and I was coming to Cyprus, so I said, hey, what's Cyprus and what's Neolithic? I found this little gem.
Now, I'm not going to say this patron's name. It is the internet, and I do believe in a right to privacy. If they want me to, I will in the next video, or if they comment who they are, I'll highlight it, but I'd rather ask permission. But they got this for one donation. That's it, just one. Imagine what you could do with 10. Or what 20 of you could get with 20. And I'm going to be posting a bit more on Patreon so you get a little bit for your money too. So go on, check it out. In the meantime, that's all I have to say on Khirokitia and the Neolithic Cyprus, at least for this video. So please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And until next time, I'm the Archaeologist, and this has been The Travels.